Welcome to June. Hope that everybody, if you are in a school, was able to end the school year and is looking forward to a fun-filled summer. So we've got quite a bit to talk about today. And we are going to be joined the second half of the hour, or the second half of the meeting, the second hour, by our Bold New Futures Committee to start talking about the new graduation requirement draft language. So excited about that. We have got our new BHAG to kind of start discussing today, as well as some updates from some other committees. And then if you did not get a chance earlier to look at the state and federal requirements documents that I sent out, if you can get those and just kind of have those ready to take a look at, because that's been a lot of the questions that we've been fielding around our work as we start looking at new assessment systems, is how does that fit in with the state and the federal guidelines? So lots to talk about today. We're going to kick off with Kathy giving us some feedback from some of the other committees that she's been in discussion with. So Kathy, I can see you there. You want to take it away?
Hello, everyone. Happy Monday. I thought I'd start off. I just kind of outlined what I might share with you guys, and one of them is just talking about the themes that have stood out in our meetings has been cross-committee meetings, as well as our BHAGs, our committee meeting highlights, and so those are the things that I thought I would share with you guys. Starting off with the cross-cultural meetings, since our spring council meeting, all the committees have had at least one meeting and discussed plans for cross-cultural meetings. And that was one of the things that came out of all of after we had our council meeting, was a dialogue for our committees based upon our BHAG and the KBE, the Kentucky Board of Education request for looking at and addressing the portrait of a learner. So we have 3 members from the Cool Council that are serving on the KBE Portrait of a Learner Committee, and they're Sarah Snipes and Andre Rupp and Audrey Gilbert. So our teams each one of our committees will be represented there. So that's the cross-cultural thing that's been going on. In May, on the 17th, on the 12th of May, our Bold New Futures committee met with our planning committee to talk about how we could come together to talk about the portrait of a learner. And so this meeting is going to be held tonight, and members from both committees were invited to join if they wanted to. Our next overall, our meetings, when we discussed them, they addressed our BHAG. And every meeting, everyone was looking at what their BHAG was, and also looking at the portrait of a learner and how that's going to be implemented, and giving feedback on implementation of graduation requirements. And then our planning for our committee engagement in our August KBE board retreat. So those are some of the things that have been discussed. Everyone should be, and if you're not, Sarah has sent out the email on several occasions regarding what our BHAG is, and I'll just read it real quickly. It is to define and compare multiple possible models for a future assessment and accountability system that considers the lessons learned from the research and preparation of the Accelerating Innovation Standing Committee, our mid-year progress report to the Kentucky United We Learn Council, and meet our design principles. This would include exploring opportunities and trade-offs within our local, state, and federal context. So those things have already been, will be part of our meeting tonight in terms of what our BHAG looks like. The Vibrant Learning Committee, they have developed their BHAG as well, and it's to develop a draft of public-facing collections of examples of vibrant learning from across Kentucky in alignment with our commitment to shining through sharing. And so they are looking at simple shifts and entry points for vibrant learning. They're looking for evidence of vibrant learning and maps of where vibrant learning is happening. So that's their BHAG. Unfortunately, I could not find or remember what the Bold New Futures is, but the work that we've done with them this last month suggests that, again, they are also focused on where is that cross-committee connection that we can make with our different teams. And later on, someone else may be able to share with you what those are. So our meetings, as you know, this is our second meeting since we met since April, and it's been about writing our BHAG, which everyone was given the opportunity to chime in on what the BHAG looks like. And then today we're going to view the portrait of a learner. The Vibrant Learning Committee, they focused on also looking at connecting to us as a basis for them doing the work that they're to do. They discussed looking at a liaison that we might have between the two groups so that we can share information readily about what's going on. And they were very specific in saying that they wanted to stay on the same page with us when it comes to the portrait of a learner. Let's see what else they discussed. I think those were the biggest things that they have discussed in the BHAG. Their next meeting is June 21st from 4:30 to 6 p.m. And Bold New Futures Committee, they met on May 1st. And that committee, well, before meeting after they met on May 1st was when they determined that they wanted to meet with our committee to talk about what the portrait of a learner looks like and to build that collaboration so that we're all in sync when it comes to what we're writing as we think about policies and regulations. Their next meeting is June 5th, which is today. They're going to meet just before we meet with them, and then they'll meet again on July 11th. I think that's, you guys, does that sound like I covered everything in terms of updates on what's going on with our committees? Did I miss anything? Okay.
I don't think so. Thank you, Kathy, for sharing all that information. I really appreciate you kind of keeping up with that for us so we can kind of stay abreast of what's going on with the other committees and how our work synchronizes with theirs. Next, we're going to be spending the most of our meeting today looking at how are we going to operationalize our BHAG. But prior to that, do we have any report from Andre prior to that?
Yeah.
Okay, I was looking at the agenda and I didn't see it on there, but then I think she said something about that. So Andre is going to report out about KBE. Is that correct, Andre?
Yeah, I'll do that very quickly. So hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So for context, the board had called into life 3 working groups in the month of May. And the 3 working groups, in my view, mirrored the 3 committees that we are having quite closely. One was chaired by Sarah, one was chaired by Audrey, and one was chaired by me. And the focuses were then, on vibrant learning, on accountability, which touches on public policy, and our committee was predominantly focused on assessment. And the goal was really to bring board members a little bit up to speed about what the committees and the School Council had been doing so far, but also to give them some provocation and resources really from the field about what the current state of the art around these topics were. So it was only 3 sessions that were about a 1 hour long, and people had limited time outside of those sessions to spend on this. So it was, as you can imagine, relatively compact and compressed. And so what we did in our group was I shared with them the entire report that we had done. And I created essentially 3 slide decks and presentations where I walked through some current thinking and curated a variety of resources that are also in our Zotero library and that you can gladly have access to. They're currently sitting on a folder in a G drive that we can merge into our materials, excuse me. And then the 3 goals that we had identified for our working group in particular were to think about design principles for assessment from the board perspective. And what I did for that is I did bring our design principles into that work, and I also shared some other design principles from publications that ours were informed with and they're related to them. So we had a little bit of a discussion about design principles, and they had some chance to reflect on that and provide some feedback on that, and they're sort of just wrapping that up now. And then the other piece is we talked about theory of actions. So like, what do we want the logic model? What do we want the actions that the state and districts are going to be taking in a future-oriented assessment system? What might be the outcomes? What might be some resources or facilitating factors, some constraints or limiting conditions? What are some underlying values and what are some ways of evaluating this. And so I gave them different ways of thinking through that, in tabular form and graphical form, and they had some chance also to just like play with that a little bit, reflect upon it, and give some initial feedback. And just like literally today was the last deadline for giving them some feedback. And my understanding is that Meredith Brewer is now in charge of synthesizing the work across these working groups for the board and creating, I don't know whether it's going to be exactly some language for this document that the board has to call to it as a call to action, kind of public facing document and initiative that will essentially be messaging around the Cool Council effort that they're working on. I don't know whether what form that will exactly take, but I know she's working on that now. And the board is also meeting tomorrow and Wednesday to discuss where they are. And I can tell you, one of the things that we've been talking about in our group is really to see this as a part of a longer term process, right? To really say, look, people had very limited time to just get up to speed a bit, engage with the current thinking. It's a lot of complex ideas. It's a lot of resources to process. So in the next few months, hopefully, the board can further deliberate on what their stances are and also then share their thinking back with the Cool Council and our committee. So my personal hope is that whatever representations, the board feels comfortable with around the theory of actions and design principles, which should reflect our thinking naturally, but that gets shared back with us and the other committees, and then there's some sort of mutual reflection cycle going on. I just can't speak to what the exact nature of that is because that's currently TBD. But I feel like what this has done is it has given, I think, at least the members in my group a little bit of a better understanding, where our committee has been working on. And your report really has been appreciated by board members. Board members saying, thank you so much for sharing that with us and all the details. It was really helpful for getting a sense of at least, what has been done and what some of the issues are that you're wrestling with. And I think it has given the board members also some renewed appreciation for some of the complexities of the work that need to be addressed moving forward. And so I think in that sense, I feel like it was a good 3 weeks. It was 3 weeks, a good 3 weeks, but it is just a piece of a longer term strategy. Jennifer, do you want to add anything to this? I know you were with me in the group.
Sure, thanks, Andre. I can add just a couple of pieces. I really appreciated the learning from you, Andre. It did feel like that I was part of a graduate level crash course in different things. So we appreciate your leadership on that very much. Also, I just want to reiterate one piece that you said is that the board members more than once refer to our Accelerating Innovation midterm report that was shared, and they internalized it, they read it, and they were quoting it back. So your work was valued by the board members, and so that's going to be an important artifact of the Cool Council at large, as well as the Accelerating Innovation Committee. So I really appreciate that. And I want you to know how valuable the work that you did is seen and is being utilized.
Thank you, Andre and Jennifer. I think that moves us on into kind of springboarding that work that we did previously. And I apologize, my child's homesick and I'm working from home today. So if you're screaming, it's him in the background. But moving along into operationalizing our next 6 months goal and thinking about how we want to divide that work out and what we're looking at doing. And so Susan and Jennifer and Sandy are going to kind of walk us through the protocols for that. So I'll turn that over to you and put myself back on mute.
Thank you, Sarah. So as has been mentioned, we've landed on a BHAG. We had overwhelming support for the BHAG that really focuses on taking what we've learned from the last 6 months and trying to envision what might a future-oriented system of accountability and assessment in the state of Kentucky looks like based on what we've learned. And our goal is how we're thinking about operationalizing this is coming up with sort of a locally controlled model to explore based on the local examples that we've learned from here in Kentucky. What would a state supported model look like? Some of the learning like from New Hampshire PACE, and then other sort of examples of state supported models. And then what would sort of a fully state centralized model look like? We're drawing from the history of the state assessment here in Kentucky, as well as other innovative state assessment programs. And so in order to do this, we've sort of set up in today's meeting a series of sort of learning and talking through exercises before we can jump into the work. We have to sort of learn what are the current state and federal laws and regulations that apply to this work, right? So ensuring that whatever sort of models that we come up with or prototypes for designs we come up with are within the sandbox that we have to play in terms of meeting state and federal requirements. And then also sort of what examples sort of represent a local control model, a state supported model, and a state centralized model. How might we wrap our heads around what each of those three things means, or what might we draw inspiration? And so I'm going to share just a quick document with you that we'll go through in more detail. It's in our member drive. I'll put it in the chat. And this is going to structure our conversation for the next half hour. At 4:50 then, we'll sort of close up this part of the meeting. And then at 5 o'clock, the Portrait of a Learner Graduation Requirements Subcommittee will meet. So if you remember, there was overwhelming support for forming that subcommittee. So we have kind of a split focus here. We have our BHAG goal as for our whole committee. And then we have a subcommittee working on coordinating with the Bold New Futures Committee. So that work will happen from 5 to 6 tonight. And Sarah will sort of escort us through that process when that happens. So we have now until 5:50 to sort of wrap our heads around what does this mean? How are we going to make progress towards our BHAG in the next month before we meet again in July? And what does that mean for the work we'll do together? So I see many of you are in this document. I'm also sharing my screen. We have our BHAG up top. And then we've linked in the wonderful documents that Jennifer shared, our federal and state requirements as they pertain to assessment and accountability. And then we have some examples. Sandy is going to walk us through what are some assessment and accountability examples that fall into each of these three categories of models. Many of these are drawn from our report. Some of them are new that he's pulled from elsewhere. And then what we're going to spend time today walking through is, okay, what is going to define our prototype? How are we actually going to operationalize and talk about models? And my goal is that by the end of today, by 4:50, all of your names are populating here, and we've formed sort of 3 little working groups that are committed to developing a prototype over the next month and answering some of the questions in this template. So before I turn it over to Jennifer to walk us through the state and federal regulations that pertain to this work, do we have any questions about sort of the high level overview of what our plan is for today and what we're hoping to accomplish? All right, Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you then.
Thanks, Susan, and good afternoon again, everyone. Thanks for being here and spending part of your Monday afternoon with us. So before we get into the next 6-month goal, we're going to talk just a few minutes about state and federal requirements for both assessment system and the accountability system. So we're going to talk just a little bit about those, and I'm going to share. You've got the links in the document that Susan just shared, but I'm also going to share my screen as well. I think that I have the ability to do that. There we go. So let's start with the assessment system, in that there are requirements from the federal government, and there's also requirements from the state. So that those are, they're related, but there are some nuances and some differences that the state values beyond what the federal government values. So I'm going to go to that's the peer review process. The table first. And the table on assessment it demonstrates what is currently required through the ESSA statute, then the state statute, and how we are currently fulfilling each of those requirements. So as you can see, the U.S. Department of Education requires that the math and reading or language arts be assessed every year, 3 through 8, and then once at the high school. The state also aligns directly with that assessment, and the U.S. Department of Education goes beyond that and says science. So the 3 content areas that are required from the U.S. Department of Education are reading, math, and science. The state, as you can see, we go beyond that with the requirement of social studies, on-demand writing, and editing mechanics. So those assessments are met with the current Kentucky Summative Assessment and also our alternate Kentucky Summative Assessment. The department, they require students that have the most significant cognitive disabilities are also assessed. The state doesn't have any type of language in the regulation or the statute for the alternate assessment, but what they do say is they have a little phrase that says the Board of Education shall add any other component necessary to meet federal requirements, and we do that through, again, the alternate Kentucky Summative Assessment. Then again, Kentucky goes beyond what the department requires in the fact that we give a college admissions exam. So in the state statute 158-6453, it does require a college admissions exam. We did a competitive bid for that, and ACT was the winner of that competitive bid. So students at grade 11 are administered the ACT. This past year, we had the opportunity to also offer our seniors the college admission exam, and we're hoping that we're able to do that again for this upcoming year. The ESSA says that all students that are English learners also receive an assessment, and the students who are in the alternate English language proficiency program as well, they are assessed. And again, the state doesn't have the particular language, but it does have that, again, that phrase that the Board of Education shall comply with the ESSA. We currently are administering the Access. We are a part of a consortium it's called the WIDA Consortium, that it provides us both the access, the alternate access for our English language learners, and that is grades K through 12. Now, ESSA does have some flexibilities on the assessments, but they also have some requirements that must be met in the development of those assessments. And that's where the other document, the peer review document, so the requirements for federal and state development of the assessments. So the most important point here within this document is that there are technical components that must be met when creating an assessment, a state level assessment. First and foremost, it must be aligned with the state's academic content standards and address both the depth and breadth of all of those standards. So that's an important component when we start talking about developing a statewide system, is that the statewide system has to meet these critical elements. Now, how the state demonstrates that our assessment meets these national standards is we do what we call submission of a peer review documentation. So we have to regularly submit documentations, whether it's documents, reports, studies, websites that demonstrate that our assessments are aligned to those standards, that it meets the test design and development technical quality, that they're sound, there's a standardized administration of those, that there are a number of test security procedures that take place across districts, they're valid and they are reliable. And we do include all students, whether the student are English learners or students with disabilities. So again, those are the assessment pieces and the requirements for meeting technical standards. As we move along to accountability, there are some, again, some areas where the U.S. Department of Education has requirements, and then places where the state goes beyond the federal requirements. The U.S. Department of Education requires that the state systems, accountability systems, have multi-indicators. So there's a number of valid, reliable, comparable measures that can be disaggregated between student demographic groups. Now, there are requirements within those indicators in that the academic indicators must have the greater weight than the non-academic indicators. And again, the all schools must be included in the accountability. So we include all schools, and they then, of the schools, by federal guidelines, we're only required to federally define the lowest 5%, which is the comprehensive support and improvement. Then targeted support and improvement, those are the schools that have student demographic groups who are performing as low as the schools identified for comprehensive support and improvement. And then we have to, the third category for federal classification is the additional targeted support and improvement. And those are the schools that have been identified for additional support. So they've been in there. The other piece of the comprehensive support and improvement is the high schools that fall below 80% of graduation rate. So there's two different categories there for CSI. Now, Kentucky requirements go a little further into prescriptive nature. So as you can see, those are just some really big categories. However, Kentucky state statute is more prescriptive. In the Senate Bill 158 in the 2020 legislative session, they put together an exclusive list of state indicators. So when they put that word exclusive in there, we took that to mean that these were what was to go into Kentucky's school accountability system and nothing else, because it's an exclusive list. So you can see there, it's state assessment results for both reading and math, and then for science, social studies, and writing. the progress toward English language proficiency as demonstrated on that access and alternate access for our English language learners, the quality of school climate and safety. There's a survey, our high school graduation rates. In Kentucky, we use both the 4 and we value the persistence toward graduation in the 5-year rate as well. We have post-secondary readiness. And then in the statute, Senate Bill 158, again, it has that phrase, any other mandated factor to meet that. The statute goes on to, in Kentucky, to evaluate for status, which is current year performance, and change, which means the current year compared to the prior year performance. And then again, those federal classifications. So I just want to show you here these tables. The last thing that we look at are these tables. You can see that the academic achievement, other academic indicator, English language proficiency, and the school quality and student success. Those are the 4 big components that the U.S. Department of Education mandates. And as you can see, for high schools, they go into graduation rate rather than the other academic indicator. So you can see that the Kentucky requirements, we've aligned those exclusive lists of indicators to align to those ESSA indicator requirements. For the school quality and student success component of ESSA, you can see that at the elementary and middle school, Kentucky has 2 indicators that align to it. And then at the high school, it has 4. So you can see that, again, Kentucky goes beyond the ESSA indicators. So just a high level overview of our assessment system, our accountability system, and the peer review process. So let me pause there and see if we have any questions, and then I'll turn it back over to Susan and Sandy. Andre.
And others can ask a question first. I just want to make a quick point before we hope.
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. So I think one thing that I would want to call out is that as you all are looking at examples of different systems, there's 2 different lines that can be drawn around these different systems, the assessment and accountability systems. So one is what I might call the narrower line, which is sort of also, Jennifer, what you were describing here, where essentially you look at that from the requirements perspectives, and you look at it a lot from the instrumentation, right? The kind of assessments that are in play, and the assessments here writ large to some degree, where like surveys, climate surveys might play into this, but also the achievement-based assessments. And then there's this sort of second ring around this, and Jen and I were talking back and forth about this today, which is, so what about all this stuff that happens around the assessments that local school districts and schools really need in order to support student learning, right? Like, what about the professional development of teachers around curricula implementation and assessment literacy? What about high quality instructional materials, and so on and so forth? And I think when we want to be future oriented, I would recommend that we all sort of take that more integrative lens. That I think this sort of like the sort of instrumentation lens is helpful to sort of say, like, how do these different states or in these different contexts, what assessments are at play, how are they being used, what's being valued, but also what are the agencies or the local districts doing around that to support student learning, which really gives life to and value to the way assessment information and other instructionally relevant actions are being taken. So.
Right. As you mentioned, there's lots that goes into student outcomes, curricular decisions, high quality materials. There's a lot more than assessments.
Yeah, it's such a great point, Andre and Jennifer. As we start conceptualizing what our prototypes might look like, something that our facilitation team has sort of thought about is using our habits as a lens to explore those things. So for example, what would a truly reciprocal accountability system look like, where there's reciprocity between the local and the state, right? So if we're holding students accountable for literacy in the 3rd grade, what types of supports also are going into the system in terms of pre-K or high quality or the science of reading and professional development, things like this, right? So I hope that as we go through this exercise of developing our prototypes, we feel at liberty to not only sort of define ourselves by what the law is defining. Yes, we must stay in that. We must design a system that meets state and federal law, but I invite us to think really broadly what it means to assess, what it means to be held accountable, and not let the definitions provided by the law limit that kind of thinking, because I think there is a lot of flexibility. We just have to open ourselves up to it. And so with that in mind, I'll turn it over to Sandy, who will explore some of the models and places where people have done things differently. And Sandy, are you there? I know he was having internet trouble.
I have connectivity issues, but hopefully keeping my camera off will make it easier to stay connected. So I'm just going to be walking us through essentially this table, which contains examples of each of the 3 kind of levels of centralization that Susan just walked through in terms of both assessment and accountability, with examples both from the report that this committee put together, as well as other examples that I have found either through my own experience or in literature that we've made available through Zotero. So to start out, these columns describe 3 different essentially levels of control. And then each row is either assessment or accountability examples, like I said, from either the report or somewhere else. So I'm just going to kind of generally go top left to bottom right and give a high level overview of both what is linked as well as how it meets the description of, for example, a locally controlled assessment system from within our report. So I'm going to start with Finland, and this is a system that came up in the context of the report really positively. It seems like the research that went into Finland's system produced some really strong insights into potentially desirable aspects of an accountability system. So if you take this link here, it's just going to take us to the report. And specifically, if I was able to do this successfully, it will link right to the section, there we go, on Finland. So this description here is kind of a high-level overview of Finland's system through the lens of what is relevant to our work in Kentucky. So starting out kind of, this description is just some high-level information about what makes Finland's system on its face appear particularly effective. So here we note both Finland's PISA results, that's an international assessment, not only in terms of kind of baseline performance, but also socioeconomic inequality or lack thereof. But it's also particularly notable because, as noted here, Finland does not use any standardized testing to evaluate students or schools. And so when we're thinking about assessment, that's where we get into this idea of a fully locally controlled assessment system. So the report gets a bit into how essentially all of the assessment that occurs in Finland up until college matriculation is performance assessment that is locally generated. Now, one thing that's important throughout this entire process is being willing to recognize the challenges that are inherent in some of these systems. And that's something we get into a bit in the report, is that it requires an immense amount of investment in this particular instance in training so that educators are in a position to create the high quality performance assessments needed to sustain this system. And it also requires an immense amount of trust, desire to kind of hold one another accountable locally, getting into the aspects of accountability in Finland's system. And in the report, we note a little bit, sort of the challenges of potentially trying to introduce this kind of system in the United States, where historically the approach to accountability has been a bit different. Moving to the idea of a state-supported assessment case study from our report, and I'm mostly going to stick to our report just because it's easier to link to and requires kind of less ramp up, although I'll point you to the resources for the external ones. Here we're getting into New Hampshire, so a domestic example, and particularly PACE, which was their Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority based assessment prototype that consisted of several years of development and piloting. So here we have a system where assessment is state supported, in that the state does play a role in supporting teachers in developing assessments, and there is a state level assessment component to the system, but there's also, as we highlight here, this is combined with a fairly serious commitment to local and state level assessments simultaneously. So I don't want to get into kind of reading the entire table here, and much less, getting into the original document on which this brief summary is based. But the idea of this table is to guide us toward the resources that we'll need when we're working on these things in a little bit more detail. And I just want to shout out Tracy for the really nice case study that she has compiled and that will surely be consulted as we get deeper into this. Then as far as state centralized examples go, here we have both domestic and international examples from our report. So one that's probably quite familiar to most folks on this call is CURIS. Of course, that was an example of state centralized assessment that nonetheless was trying to do something different from what had come before it. So the kind of high level point I think I want to highlight here is that a state centralized system does not equate to a system that is not innovative. There are certainly still ways in which a state centralized system could represent a significant improvement over current practice, but it will require some creativity in thinking about what a state centralized system might be. And then here we've got some examples outside of Kentucky and outside of our report, both from the past, which is Vermont's Portfolio Assessment Program, which was created in the early 90s, as well as an ongoing project in North Carolina. So here, this is another example of an IADA, an Innovative Assessment Demonstration Authority, but this is under development and actually has not yet gone operational. So this is something that we'll want to keep an eye on over the next few years, this idea of personalized assessment in a state centralized system. Going back left across this row, I have some examples from my current home state of Colorado, where the state has taken a role of differing levels of control in certain aspects of assessment. So here, all the way on the left is a really nice locally controlled example of a capstone project for graduation that was implemented in one of Colorado's districts, Canyon City. And then here in the state supported column, we have a bit of a hybrid, which is the Colorado READ Act. Now this mandates assessment of reading for students by grade 3 and requires remediation if students don't meet a particular benchmark. It's state supported, but not state centralized, in that there's a menu of assessments, and local educational authorities have the flexibility to choose from among this list. Now, moving to accountability, things change a little bit, because these first two rows are really about what is the assessment, who is creating it, who has control over when it's administered, as well as what it contains. Now, accountability examples change a bit, because here the focus is more on both who gets to define an accountability system, as well as who is being held accountable. So here, going back again to Finland, Finland is an interesting example of accountability, because as I alluded to earlier, it really is a heavily trust-based system. So in the mid-year report, we get a little bit into, and I'm just gonna follow my own link here again. We get a bit into what accountability looks like in Finland. And here the thing to highlight is that really it's generally something that happens within each district. Teachers are sort of the people being held accountable, but not in a punitive sense, like under, for example, No Child Left Behind, where teacher pay was heavily tied to performance, and in fact still is in some states. This is more kind of a continuous improvement model. Now, this was another thing that was highlighted in the report as a potential tension with the American approach to accountability, but it is worth considering as kind of a way of expanding what we might think of as a traditional accountability system. Here we have a really brief section in the report on Canada. Now, this is something that would certainly require more research than what's available just in the report, but Canada uses province-specific accountability systems. So the provinces, essentially being the states of Canada, each define their own accountability system. And this is, in some sense, somewhat similar to the American approach, in that the assessment certainly can differ from state to state, province to province. But in Canada, the system takes things a step further, and actually the entire system of holding districts and schools accountable can differ from one province to the next. It's still state supported in that it is mandated by the federal government, but beyond that, there's really a very minimal role for the federal government in accountability in Canada. And then here we've got, again, some more examples from the report. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but I will just point out like what a state, kind of the boundaries of what a state centralized system can look like. And we can do that through two domestic examples. So the Arkansas system that we highlight is, I believe, currently under development or just being piloted, but this is an approach that heavily emphasizes multiple measures. So they have this policy that they call student-focused learning, and it's focused on content mastery, which certainly aligns with interest in competency-based education in Kentucky. And then here we also highlight their approach to measuring school quality for federal accountability. So here we have this kind of link to a snapshot of the system that notes that school quality is measured using numerous indicators, not only status and growth in math and ELA, but also status and growth in science, computer science credits earned by students, accelerated coursework completed by students, college placement tests, community service credits, student GPAs, and more. So the nice thing about this example is that it consists of a number of parts that are already potentially available in Kentucky. Certainly it wouldn't be totally plug and play, and there would be some necessary differences here. But to me, at least, this reads as something that might be potentially very achievable as a state centralized system. Now, the domestic policy that kind of represents, in my mind, sort of the other end of the bookending here would be the Massachusetts graduation requirement, which was also investigated as part of our report. And this is a graduation requirement that is fulfilled using a standardized test. So this is another example of what accountability can look like under a state centralized system. And here, who is being held accountable is individual students. And the mechanism by which they're being held accountable is the standardized test. Now, we note in the report that this is unlikely to be something that meets with the kind of values and desires of the committee in terms of developing a prototype. But again, the aim here is just to provide examples, not necessarily to provide only positive examples or examples that we feel would be a good fit. And the last thing I want to highlight under other accountability examples, and I won't go into all of them here just to save time, but I want to highlight these two lines here. So New Zealand and England. And what these refer to is a resource that I've placed in our Zotero. So I'm going to briefly unshare and then reshare my screen over in Zotero. So folks who have not yet created an account, I would highly recommend doing so, because once you have access to the Zotero that we are using to store resources, we've got all of this great stuff here. And one thing that I've added is this book called Educational Authorities in the Schools, Organization and Impact in 20 States. States here being countries, not American states. It's a really nice book that just has an overview of how these 20 different education systems operate. And here we've got the chapter on New Zealand. So I noted New Zealand because, as it says here in the abstract, New Zealand has a very decentralized system of self-managed schools. Each of the over 2,000 state schools is governed by parent-elected boards of trustees who employ the principal. So this is very, I'm not going to go through the details of New Zealand's system here, but I would highly recommend at least investigating the New Zealand chapter if you're working on state support, or the England chapter if you're working on state centralized. Because these chapters are very policy focused, which is really nice. Like this one's here, it says, included in this chapter are accounts of 3 national policies and the factors that helped or hindered their realization in schools. So they're really thinking in the terms that are relevant to our work here. And they have, New Zealand and England are the two I highlighted because I thought they were particularly good fits. But if we go up to the table of contents, if I can manage to find it, let's see here. Yeah, here we go. It's organized geographically. So, we've got a chapter on Finland here, also several other Nordic countries that we did not have the chance to get to in the report. Another whole section on Middle Europe. We've got the North American states and then the Commonwealth. And, this is just laid out to really give you an overview of essentially, in my mind, almost all of the education systems that we might care about when we're looking for inspiration for how a system might work in Kentucky under a variety of different parameters. So obviously, we're not expecting anyone to read through all of these, but those abstracts can be a really nice way of filtering out. Here's what we think could potentially be relevant for our work. Here's what we think is maybe not so relevant and we won't take the time. So with that, I'm going to just turn it over for any kind of brief questions if committee members are curious about access to resources. Otherwise, I think we can probably keep moving forward.
questions for Sandy? Sandy, thank you. That was incredibly thoughtful and informative and really helpful to ground us and point us in terms of where we can find additional resources as we're building our prototypes. Just in the interest of time, I'd like to point everybody back into the document we've been working in. I'll link it again in the chat. And if you wouldn't mind just taking the next minute to fill in your name where you might like to work over the next month. So the idea would be that for the month of June, we'll be working in working groups to develop either a locally controlled prototype, a state supported prototype, or a state centralized prototype. So go ahead and add in your name. You can see who your leaders and facilitators will be. You can pick based on topic or on facilitator. And then the questions below will guide the prototype design. We won't have time to go through those today, but certainly in your working groups, those are the questions that we'll be working with. And so while you're filling in your names in that table, I'll turn it back to Sarah and Kathy to wrap up the Accelerating Innovation Standing Committee meeting.
Thank you, Susan, Jennifer, and Sandy. So that was a very informative discussion. I know we're moving kind of quickly through a lot of information today, and we'll be going through once you sign up and be getting out some further information later on this month as we look towards what the work that we're going to be doing and operationalizing this next BHAG. Does anybody have any comments before Kathy and I move on to the next item on the agenda today? Okay. All right. So rounding us up before we're joined by the Bold New Futures Committee, Kathy and I were just curious as to, one of our focuses for the next 6 months is really emphasizing our cross-committee collaboration based on the desires of the council as a whole. So based on our conversation today, what do you feel like the other committees need to know in regards to our BHAG and our work for the next 6 months?
And this is just a reminder that the other committees have not met. And so each month we'll be bringing updates and responses from them about how they want to do the cross connection. So right now, we're the first group to meet, and they'll be sharing with each other what they learned, what our committee has done today. And then as we move forward, each time we meet, we'll be sharing what the committees have been doing. I think everyone is signing up for a committee. Is that what you guys are doing?
I think so.
Maybe repeat the question for folks, Sarah, that might be helpful.
So what, in your opinion, do we need to focus on sharing with other committees about our work for our BHAG for the next 6 months? Now, I certainly think for myself, one of the key pieces for me is the connections between the work that you all did in the last 6 months that led to our report from the previous 6 months BHAG on the research that we did both in and outside of Kentucky. And so I want to emphasize to the other committees how this new BHAG really connects to and builds upon that work, because it is important, and we want to make sure that we're taking into consideration all of the systems that we've considered.
Also, based upon the work that we're doing, are there any questions or anything that you would like for us to take to the other committees? Questions you might have about Bold New Futures or for Vibrant Learners? Well, we know it's a lot to think about.
Mhm.
Don't worry about it. You can always send us an email. We're always open to, because I always get off our planning committee meetings and I think of things and I start shooting emails out to everyone. So if you think of something, go, oh, I should have said something, go ahead and send us that email and we'll be happy to, respond to it and make sure we include it in our updates as we provide updates to the other committees.
Agreed. And I know we were kind of ran out of time today to really walk through the different prototypes. So we'll be sending that information out later as well, just to kind of inform our work over the course of the next month prior to our meeting in July. So I know we've got some other people that are going to be joining us here shortly. And I know I've got some other people hopping in. This meeting's getting pretty full. And we're going to be turning that over towards Andre as he kind of takes on that direction for the conversations around. And Andre, is that the right person? I'm sorry. Am I naming you are the next person?
I think it's Susan.
Is it Susan? Sorry. I'm getting people mixed up here. Towards the conversation regarding the proposed draft language for graduation requirements centered around Portrait of a Learner. So if you want to stay on for that conversation, then you are more than welcome to. But otherwise, if you are on the AISC committee, we will see you next month and we'll be following up with you by email. I was planning on staying on, but circumstances at home are going to have me getting off, and I'll catch up with you all later then. Jennifer,
Sarah?
anything else to add? Yes.
Yes, just one thing. Next month, July, our regular standing committee is scheduled for July 3rd. That's a Monday, and the 4th of July is on Tuesday. So no, that's a good time to take vacation or at least a day off. We'll be reaching out to you for possibly rescheduling that meeting, maybe the following week. That would be the 10th, maybe the Monday the 10th, but we'll do a poll for you to see if that is a possible of good timing for everyone. So please note that we'll be reaching out about the July Accelerating Innovation Standing Meeting and possibly rescheduling that for later in the month.
Yes, good thinking ahead, Jennifer. Thank you. I hadn't thought about the timing for that next meeting, and that probably would work best for other people to be able to take some vacation that week. All right.
Or at least an extended weekend.
Extended weekend, that's right. All right, Susan, well, I'm going to officially turn this over to you to start the second half of this meeting for discussion around Portrait of a Learner and draft language.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And thank you to our graduation requirement subcommittee members for staying on. But really, this is the Bold New Future subcommittee meeting that we are now joining. So I'll turn it over to the Bold New Future committee leads to orient us to the agenda. I know I see Meredith here.
Thanks, Susan. I'm trying to see if Caleb is on. I think he's first up, but he may not be. Oh, he said he's on his way. Okay. Real-time updates. I know that it's a crazy time. The end of the school year is always such a busy time of year for everyone. So I apologize for his delay. But welcome. We're excited to have this cross-committee meeting. We appreciate you taking some time to meet with us. So once Caleb pops on, I will let him sort of formally welcome you on behalf of our committee, but we'll go ahead and jump to the next agenda item, which is actually an update on the state board. So, let me see if we have, I thought I saw someone have a question, but I don't believe so. Okay.
I think Linda has her hand up, Meredith.
Hi, Meredith. You have two sign language interpreters today, and we need to be able to pin. Can you give us permission to have multiple pins so we can pin as necessary for us to be highlighted for the deaf participant that you have today?
I would love to be able to do that, but I think that's going to be up to Susan. So Susan, are you able to make that happen?
Yes, thank you, Linda. I believe I've just enabled that. Please let me know if I have not.
Okay, I will let you know here shortly. I only have one pen enabled.
Okay.
Let me see if I can practice on you as add a pen. Yes, I can add a pen now. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, and Linda, that was perfect timing because I see that Caleb has joined us. So we'll go ahead and pitch to Caleb first and let him welcome you all to our committee and sort of give you a preview of where we're headed this evening. And then I will provide an update on the state board. So Caleb, welcome.
Hello, and thank you for that welcome, Dr. Brewer. I really appreciate it, and very excited to be here tonight with everyone. Just to remind everyone that we are here to do some very great work rooted in a community collaboration and really thinking about how our policies in Kentucky might reflect the goals of our education stakeholders and their vision for the future of education here in the Commonwealth. So again, excited to be here and look forward to turning things over to you, Dr. Brewer.
Thanks, Caleb. All right, so I did want to provide just a quick update. So those on the call that are part of the Bold New Future Committee heard much of what I am about to share, but we wanted to be sure that our friends on Accelerating Innovation have the same sort of foundational understanding of where we're sort of headed. So at this time, the state board is working toward entertaining amendments to the graduation requirement regulation at their meeting in October. So what that will mean is that if they were to take action and approve those amendments, that regulation would work its way through the regulatory review process, which can be quite lengthy, about 6 to 9 months. So the hope would be that that regulation would be totally finalized in time for the start of the 2024 academic year, so fall of 2024. And those amendments would then require that the graduating class of 2028, so those freshmen entering in 2024, would have, as part of their graduation requirements at the state level, an expectation for a defensive learning aligned to either the state level portrait of a learner or a locally adopted portrait. As we know, and I'll sort of preview a bit of John's presentation, he is on deck here in a little bit. Many of our local districts have portraits, and we in no way want to supplant that work or give any indication that the state board wants you to put aside those community developed portraits. That is the best portrait of all are the ones that were developed with community member input. But there is going to be a discussion and potential motion to approve those changes in October. And that will be a big shift and an important one that will hopefully, as I shared via an email with the task that we'll talk about here in a bit, sort of a lever that we can push as a state board to hopefully encourage districts to really commit to the deep learning experiences in the classroom that the Cool Council have been discussing and that we are advocating for as part of this transformational shift in the student experience in Kentucky. So that is coming up in October. In preparation for that meeting, we will be having a retreat. Every year the board has a retreat in August, and one of the primary intentions of our retreat will be to talk about all things Portrait of a Learner and the work that the Cool Council is currently working on in the different committees to sort of support our exploration of the readiness for the state to adopt this change, as well as being sure that we are aware of district readiness, and we'll have some input from districts that will be highlighted today as well to sort of see if the field is ready for this change. We know that change is always challenging, but hopefully this will be something that elicits some really positive movement on this work. So in August, we will hopefully have some representatives from the Cool Council that would be willing to make the trip to our retreat location, which is in Dale Hollow State Park, and share with the board. And Tammy is on the call, and she will talk a bit more with Caleb and Bentley about that opportunity. So those are the main updates I wanted to share about the work of the board. It is very important. Those of you that were at the convening, I hope you heard from Chair Young that the board really wants to respond to the feedback that they receive from the council and other partners in this work. So that is the proposed timeline, but that timeline can be modified should it appear that that is the direction that is most prudent for us to take. So at this time, we are still looking for those changes to be proposed in October. Any questions about the state board? We do have a board meeting tomorrow. I'm sure you all have blocked out your calendars for the next 2 days to join us for that exciting meeting. We'll start at 2:30 tomorrow. It will be live streamed, and then we will begin at 9 a.m. on Wednesday. If you aren't able to watch us in real time, there will be a recording available that you can watch at your leisure. So with that, I think, is John here? I know he is. Oh, it looks like he may have been able to join us.
Yep, I'm here, Meredith.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Okay, so I'm going to mute and get your slides ready. John, you might be muted now. Are you ready to
Yes.
jump in?
Yes,
Sorry.
thanks, Meredith. And I apologize, folks. I'm in the midst of jumping between a couple travel locations, so I may have to mute myself if there's an announcement in the background. But for this will be a pretty just short kind of overview of some data points that we wanted to present, so hopefully it won't take too long. And Meredith, thank you so much for running the slides. We really appreciate it.
Okay, John, they should be up. Can someone let me know if you can see those?
I do not believe we're able to see those. And we're good now.
There we go. Perfect. Thanks, Meredith. So just as a background, KDE has been doing a survey for a few weeks now, and they're trying to collect data from all 178 districts that have put together profiles and portraits to date. So you can see here, they've just a few data points. They've gotten a fairly good response rate. Over half of districts that have responded to this survey. Out of those 102 districts, 93% of them, or about 95, have indicated they're either in the process of developing, have developed, or are considering developing a portrait or profile aligned set of skills. So below that, you can kind of see the number breakdown. About a third of those districts have already developed their set of skills, a third are in the process of developing, and then a chunk of them are still considering that. So on the next slide, Sarah Snipes, that is, has also been collecting some data points. So about how districts are using these profiles. So you can see that 3 of them have already started to think about how they're going to integrate their profile into graduation requirements and have done so. And 3 more are planning on how to go about doing that. You have 1 district that has created a local assessment system that involves competencies, and 10 more are in the process of doing so. And then last but not least, on the final couple of slides, you have 11 districts that have currently been thinking about how to build in the flexibility, or excuse me, are building in the flexibility for scheduling courses and programs. And there are 18 more that are in the process of creating those structures. And then 8 districts that have completed an advisory system or aligned processes to that type of system, 20 more that are looking at doing so. And then we have, some numbers as Meredith mentioned for different examples of different districts that are doing that. So those are examples that we can also share if folks are interested in specific districts. So any questions related to that either we can answer now, or we could help go look for the answers to for folks. That'd be interesting to know.
This question might come up later with when the whole process goes through the regulatory process and something is established. What happens if the districts who have already put something in place don't align?
So can you
I'm
tell me,
gonna let Meredith answer that one.
can you tell me a little more about that, Edna? So you mean like if they have a local graduation requirement and what their expectation is in conflict with the state level requirement?
Correct.
So I don't, the districts that have a graduation requirement, I don't know of any that would conflict, especially because the language that we've proposed is pretty open-ended, just that they need to have a defensive learning. So I think that would probably be unlikely, but as far as what does state requirement trump local, that sounds like a good question for an attorney. So, but I don't anticipate that it would happen, because I think the point is that you have some sort of presentation of learning. The current language allows for a portfolio or a presentation. It provides a lot of flexibility. So, but those are the sorts of things that we want to be sure to capture, because we want to always avoid unintended consequences. So that's a great question, Edna, but I'll have to defer to Todd Allen, our general counsel, on that. But if you know of, with the draft language, if you are aware of a district that would sort of create that scenario, send me an email and we'll kind of dig in and
No, I
make
don't.
sure.
I'm just being hypothetical.
Oh, good. Okay. No, that's good. I was like, oh, don't you like my non-answer? Hopefully that won't happen, but if it does, we'll figure it out. All right. Thanks, John. So let's pause for a second. That was sort of rapid fire there. So let's be sure that we revisit all that's been shared. So the board is moving forward on this as of now, working toward that October meeting date for entertaining these proposed amendments. We are gathering data at the department to sort of check on district readiness. That's what John was sharing, or what John shared. And I do think that it's a quite positive thing that a large number of our districts already have a portrait. So I think that is a good indication that they are interested and see the value in having a portrait. But not many districts have that graduation requirement yet. So that would be something that would be a pretty significant change. So that's where we sort of want to think about feedback. So with that, Caleb, shall we transition to the task that you sent out to the members? And I think Susan shared with the Accelerating Innovation Committee. We want to talk about that experience. So before I kind of dig in a little bit on the responses that we've received, I'd love to just open the floor for anyone to share about their experience completing the task. If you want to sort of speak to who you may be interviewed and asked to complete the form and what that process looked like.
I'll share. Amy Harris from Williamstown Independent. So I actually talked with some teachers and administrators. I didn't go to the student level. And I just sent out, I talked to them, but then I also sent out a Google form to collect the information. And I just asked the questions, and I talked to 5 different people, interviewed 5 different people, and all 5 have portraits of a graduate in their district, and all 5 do not have any type of graduation requirement or defensive learning. All 5 were able to share experiences of their own learning or their own teaching experience or leadership experience that would have qualified for showing what you know, showing mastery, and multiple experiences actually. All of them thought it was a fabulous idea to be able to incorporate that. And some of the benefits, obviously the opportunity for alternative ways to show mastery, and then the flexibility, student choice of how they can show what they know, how they can defend their knowledge, and what that could look like. So I know it's kind of surface level, but there's a lot of interest out there of looking at alternative ways, and the defense process. People are hearing more and more about it, and I think they're very interested in it. Some of the challenges they talked about, consistency with rubrics, making sure that it's aligned to the standards, you know, those types of things were discussed as far as some of the challenges, making sure the rigor was there.
Awesome, Amy. Thank you for sharing. That is certainly bolstering to hear that there was positive feedback. We like to hear that. Any other? Does anyone else want to share any other reflections on this task?
Jesus turns the water into wine. Chapter 2. John the Baptist denies being the Messiah.
Renee, I think you are unmuted. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. That was also an inspirational interjection, but Renee, were you wanting to share?
No.
Okay. No, that's great. That's great, Renee. Thank you. No, you're fine. No, that's great. All right. Well, let's go ahead and I will share some of the feedback that we received via the Google form. So some of the responses, Amy, may have been from your participants completing the form, because we did have some positive responses that were they shared excitement about the potential of this change, that they felt like it was a great opportunity for students. And mostly had questions about implementation, which I think we are aware that that sort of looms in the distance, right? That we can get people on board with the value of this change, but what does it look like to really support our educators in helping to ensure that students are ready for this new experience, you know, professional learning and those sorts of supports that would need to be developed and embedded within our districts. And also, you know, where would this fit in sort of an already pretty full student experience? How would we sort of make sure that there was time allocated for ensuring that students could do this well? And to your point, Amy, right, that they take it seriously, and that we have some expectations of rigor, and that we have some consistency across the experience for all students, so that we can have some comparability, so that when students say that they successfully defended their portrait, that we have a general understanding of what that would mean. We did, however, have some people that were a little more reticent to support this change. So we had some of our respondents that felt like this could potentially exacerbate inequity, that this would be something that students that have a transient home situation would really struggle to prepare and complete this expectation. We had some that sort of alluded to concerns that were taking precedent in their minds. So nutrition was something that was mentioned right now, that was really what they wished we would focus on, is nutrition in school. So valid. I can understand that that's something that is a priority. We also had a lot of comments about the value of portfolios and potentially the lack of value of portfolios. So certainly those of us that have familiarity with portfolios of days gone by, I know there's a lot of feelings about portfolios here in Kentucky, and whether or not that is something we want to bring back. So I think having the word portfolio as one of the options maybe reminded people that the portfolio process can be a bit arduous, and maybe not as fruitful or beneficial as it was intended to be. So that's certainly something to be mindful of. Lots of questions about how this would be assessed. So I think the idea about, you know, having a rubric or some sort of support for educators and sort of actually being able to evaluate whether a student successfully defended. That was brought up as well. Caleb, have you had a chance to dig in on the data? Anything you want to share from your perspective?
Well, I continually come to the thought of, and I've been fortunate, Dr. Brewer, to talk with education leaders from across the state who are at different points in this process. And so they might, be building out their portrait of a learner right now in their district. They may have already implemented theirs, but certainly have found that there is a real interest in this, and looking at what communities have to say about these different competencies that districts are considering. And so thinking about the attributes that graduates in their community need. And so I very much enjoyed seeing that, and certainly have appreciated everyone who has gathered data. And also I think that there is a lot left to be learned. And so I'm excited to think about that and to consider how we might continue to collect data and think about ways for learning more. So,
Julie, I see your hand up. Do you have a question?
I was just going to share. So our district went through the Portrait of the Learner development last year. And so we had like 120 individuals from across the county, all kinds of demographics, participate in the development. But then we also had sessions with just business leaders and community leaders and with students. And across the board, all the same competencies rose. And so we know we've hit that, and those same competencies are the ones that are in the state Portrait of the Learner also. So everybody, I think, overall is in agreement with what we want our kids to do, and now it's just figuring out how we do it. And that's where our teachers are struggling, is building the rubrics and things and how it's actually going to be executed and evaluated. So but in our county, that's where we're at as far as that point.
Thank you for sharing it. I will take this opportunity to share with the group that Julie is our newest appointed board member. So
Yes.
newly appointed board member,
Congratulations.
Julie, here providing some great perspective. But absolutely, we've heard pretty consistently that give or take a competency, portraits do look pretty similar across the board. We can get lost in the semantics and some of the language choice, but overall, people have identified sort of, critical thinking, creativity, communication. Those are sorts of competencies that we see in portraits nationwide. So that's great, because hopefully that means that the support that we can provide as a department around this potential shift will hopefully be universally helpful, even if you have your local portrait, that the resources that we provide will align well enough that they can be utilized by districts that have slightly different portraits than the state level portrait. Also tomorrow, actually no, Wednesday, on Wednesday's agenda, we'll have a presentation from the Division of Innovative Learning about performance outcomes that they have developed aligned with the state level portrait. So several years ago, we had sort of a first iteration of the portrait that had 5 competencies. And a summer ago, we did meet with a subcommittee of the state board to review those competencies that had been developed previously and discuss if there needed to be any amendment to the portrait before the board formally adopted it. And they did add a 6th competency, creative contributor. And so David's team needed to gather together some different partners to work on developing performance outcomes for that new competency. And what's great about that document, so once the board has a chance to hear about it on Wednesday, that will be posted for everyone to look at. It provides sort of what does this look like at kind of key transition points. So 3rd grade, fifth grade into sixth grade, moving into high school, and then at graduation. So I think that will be a really helpful tool that we hope to provide to districts.
Yeah, and I would like to expand just a moment. I've had a thought that has come to me after looking at the data again here. I was fortunate to visit Barron County a little while ago, and while I was there, they were actually I can't remember exactly what grade level it was that I talked with, but there was a student who had just presented his portfolio or his presentation defending his learning, and they have a portrait there in Barron County. And it reminded me of the fact that, and I certainly appreciate the work that our L3 districts have done and continue to do in laying out this vision and doing the tough work of guiding United We Learn forward. But also, I think that it's neat that we have districts across Kentucky, not just our L3 districts, but those that may not have been involved with that work, who are taking on Portrait of a Learner and who are bringing about these types of changes into fruition. So it's neat to see that. I really appreciated the opportunity to interact with a student in Barron County and to talk about their experience with that. And certainly I wanted to draw a lot to that. I think that this activity, this task that folks participated in here in our group and across groups, I suppose, it really allowed us to see beyond sort of our scope in terms of folks who are involved in this work, and to think about in the communities that we come from, the communities that neighbor ours, what this looks like. And so I'm hopeful that that's something we can continue to do as we build this out, because we do want to ensure that every district, no matter where they are at in this process, feels supported through the work that we're doing. So
Meredith, I just wanted to share with you, I am really struggling with this concept of Portrait of a Learner until I know what the foundation has been laid for the students to become graduates, because what I'm hearing, it's all good, but when you think about the underserved and the inequities that happen to still be present in our education system, how can we develop a portrait of a learner without looking at what foundation has been laid for students so that they can be successful from third grade on? And I know Whitney Stevenson, she works with preschool age children and early learners. And that is, if that foundation has not been laid, so we can talk about a portrait of a learner, but if a child is entering third grade, not able to read or not able to do math, how are we going to account for those types of things? And so when we're developing this portrait of a learner, it's important for us to think about what happens before they begin K through 12. And I think they need to be in that conversation that we're having, because, and I've shared with many people on numerous occasions, my experience of kids from first grade through third grade who cannot even write their own full name, or who can't tell you how to spell the name of the school that they attend. And if we allow for this to continue, there's no need for a portrait of a learner unless we've laid the foundation for our children and for all kids. And it's possible. Other places are doing it, other states are looking at it, and we're as always in the bottom tier, which I still think that we have quality educational services. It's just the equity in terms of serving all children and looking at the diversity that's within Kentucky. We have very diverse communities, and we've got to address the diversity that's within Kentucky. Schools, I'll just use, for example, Mississippi. You know why Mississippi is doing so well? They tend to have the lowest performing students in literacy. And the reason they have the lowest performing students is because it is a designated population of social and children of color. Social economics has impacted and children of color. So now they've got to just deal with really almost just two groups of people that they have to work with. Whereas in Kentucky, it's very broad. We have kids in rural areas, we have kids in urban areas, we have children that speak English, children that don't speak English. So we have a lot to deal with, but we've got to establish a foundation first. And so we can talk about Portrait of a Learner forever, but where's the foundation? Before they get into third grade with the expectations that they will pass a reading test, a math test, a science test. Where is that foundation laid? Because deeper learning, how can you do math problems if you can't read? How can you do science if you can't read? And some people might say, well, whose fault is that? I'm not looking at whose fault it is. I'm looking at, we have to embrace our children. They have nothing to do with all the mistakes that adults make, but we still have to educate them. So that's where that's my struggle with what we're doing now, is where is the literacy foundation for reading and math? Once those two things I feel are established, then we can talk about what the Portrait of a Learner looks like. But if we are not guaranteed that our children are prepared for all the assessments that we're going to be giving them, then there's no purpose for what we need to do.
So I just want to say, kind of thinking along those lines, as someone who grew up and still lives in a rural area and who plans to head into the classroom and teach actually English at the high school level next year, which I'm really excited about. I certainly understand those concerns there around equity and around thinking about how socioeconomic status and other factors contribute to lifelong success in education. Certainly in Eastern Kentucky, where I'm from and live, I see students who experience struggles due to no fault of their own. And so certainly I'm passionate about that. I really appreciate how KDE defines equity. And I just want to say that there's a mention of how equity is rooted in eliminating conditions that prevent the ability of all students to reach their full potential. And so when I think about Portrait of a Learner, and I've certainly grappled with those same concerns around equity, thinking about how, there are a lot of challenges that we're facing that go beyond anything that Portrait of a Learner itself can fix. But one thing that has sort of solidified my real belief in Portrait of a Learner after thinking about it is really this idea that Portrait of a Learner can ground our focus in an environment that has so many different factors affecting it, right? And it kind of allows for a common approach and also a common direction for all of us. And so I think about how, when I'm thinking about Portrait of a Learner as more than just competencies, more than just that, but as a depiction of what we want for our students. I think about how when you think about the ways that students learn and the goals that we have for them, in all reality, the goal is, in terms of Portrait of a Learner, to see students reach their full potential, and for a portrait to fit their individual needs and goals. And so I just wanted to share that thought there. I've definitely thought a lot about that and would love to talk more about that with you, just so we can bounce ideas back and forth.
So Kathy, one thing that I think it's important, and if Chair Young were here, she would do a much more eloquent delivery of this message, but you can tune into Interim Joint Committee on Education meeting tomorrow. She'll be talking about this a bit, but what she has shared and what I think is really important for us to be mindful of and to not lose sight of is that the portrait really has at the foundation academic content, right? So there's still an expectation that students are having high quality instruction, that they have access to all of the content that they've previously had, and hopefully really strengthened content delivery through deep learning. So those really aren't mutually exclusive, right? So it's not sort of like that we have to have foundational academic content exposure and then have opportunities to develop the skills and dispositions identified in the portrait. Excuse me. Choked up about it now. I just have a never-ending cold. But I do think that there is, just to acknowledge your concern and also hopefully address it, I do think that there's no question that we want students who are proficient and beyond readers and mathematicians, and we want them to also be able to exhibit the skills and dispositions in the portrait. So that empowered learner piece of the portrait, really, that's a big part of it, with the content and mastery of all of the content that you mentioned. We would certainly not be advocating for a system where a student would be able to defend that they are a creative contributor, but are not able to read proficiently. So that is not the goal. It really is sort of the marriage of all of these things that make for a well-rounded student experience. Susan, can you speak to, I'm sorry, Kathy, we'll let you go and then.
I'm sorry, so then I have to push back on that. So
Okay.
then I ask, why do we have such low literacy rates in the state of Kentucky? And so if we're looking for high quality instruction, why is literacy so low? And when I speak to the fact that I'm talking about literacy, I'm speaking before the student enters the 3rd grade, 4th grade, start looking at academic content. I'm speaking to, they just need to be literate. They need to have literacy skills. They need to know how to read a book. They need to know how to do math operations. So, I'm not saying that I'm dismissing the portrait of a learner. What I'm saying is, how can we get to the portrait of a learner unless we have built a foundation for students to be the portrait of a learner? And that begins with literacy skills.
So
That's
Kathy,
what I'm
I
saying.
hope you've had a chance to watch Mickey Ray and her team's presentation to the state board that they gave in April. If you have not, I will share the link with everyone. That is the very question that they addressed. Sort of, what does it look like to have an opportunity for students to develop their reading skills, but also have opportunities for deep learning that we know is engaging. So that is a presentation that I would encourage everyone to listen to. They, of course, are the huge advocates of the LETRS training program. I know that you're considering participating in it, Kathy. So that is something that's great. No, that's wonderful. So I think that, to your point, no one at the department is saying that our current literacy instruction is sufficient. So that's why we have this huge endeavor underway with thousands of teachers engaging in that literacy professional development. So I don't want to say that, oh, we've got our academic standards, all ready to go, and that's why we're transitioning to that. That's not at all the message that I would want to share. So agree. I think that but having high quality instruction is a goal. Also having students who have those that knowledge, skill, and disposition, that are highlighted in the portrait that we know they need to be able to successfully transition to life after high school is also valued, right? So I think this is one of those situations where we can have lots of things that we value and they're all very important. So we're not saying that one has to supersede another. But Susan, I wanted to sort of wonder if you could speak to sort of a national perspective on this, and anything from your work that you could share about kind of how we reconcile this sort of focus on competency-based education with also not forgetting how important content is for students, and that they have a mastery of all of the content areas that we know are so important. Math,
Sure,
reading, science, social studies, all of them, right?
Of course, yeah, of course. So I think the portrait of a learner or the portrait of a graduate is really just one tool in our tool belt, right? So what we're talking about here and in the Cool Council more broadly is really about changing the theory of action around how assessment and accountability functions in our state. And we're thinking about assessment and accountability really broadly here. We're not thinking about just the state accountability system that's approved by the federal government, but in this case in particular, we're thinking about what does our student accountability system look like that's in large part locally defined by districts in terms of how they graduate their learners, right? So at the end of the day, to improve student outcomes beyond where they are today, we need to think about how is adult behavior changing, right? What are the tools in our toolbox? What are the levers that we have access to that we could think about? What state policies can change in order to enable changes in adult behavior? Across the country, we've seen districts gravitating to these portraits of a learner because they reflect the things that their constituents, that their communities care about above and beyond what can be reflected by standardized test scores. And so I think what we're seeing here in Kentucky is just an example of what's happening across the country in terms of districts really wanting to be able to value communication, collaboration, creativity, and signal to their students that these are the skills we also care about, not just what's being tested and labeled in your standardized assessment. So I think that's what Kentucky is grabbing onto here, but it doesn't mean that we can let go of the focus on high academic rigorous standards. It's just one way we can think about changing what happens in classrooms with the same aim of improving outcomes for all. So I don't know if that answers your question, Meredith, but I think it's, as you said so well, it's not an either or. It's really just like, what is our mechanism? What are the levers that we have available to us? And this is just one of them.
Thanks, Susan. No, that's super helpful. And I think, Kathy, I don't want to say that what you've identified is not important. So I hope I've really, let me say again, it is important. What you're talking about is important, and we are focusing on that as well. But I think that, to Susan's point, our assessment and accountability culture has sort of evolved into one that really lends itself to a very limited perspective on what makes for a successful student experience. And so that's going to be one where students are engaging in classroom experiences that maybe we would maybe say are less meaningful to them. Maybe they don't connect to the real world as much, but it does successfully get them to a point where they can navigate a standardized test well, and they can show that they have this sort of, they've absorbed the content, but we know that that's insufficient for them, right? So students that perform really well on standardized tests don't necessarily have the other skills and dispositions that we're emphasizing in the portrait, right? You can be an outstanding test taker, but maybe struggle with communication, or maybe you haven't really had an opportunity to sort of leverage your own ways of showing your creativity. So I think it's really about that multifaceted, that kind of more complex picture of a student that we're trying to help guide our schools and districts to. So I do want to be sure that we have time to sort of talk about our fun adventure to Dale Hollow in August and see who would like to make the trip to the lake. So at this point, unless anyone has any questions, I will pitch it to Tammy, who is going to sort of engage us with what that might look like.
Well, I have no idea what the lake looks like. I'm certainly looking forward to it. And I apologize if I freeze. We're having some massive storm, and I don't know if it's connected, but internet seems a little wonky at the moment. Anyway, so, and Caleb, by all means, like, jump right in here at all moments as I mess this up. But we met really quickly late last week to kind of talk about just the top line of some of the data that John presented earlier, and then kind of complete that with the input received from both BNF and Accelerated Innovation, the reflection piece, and how that all dovetails, and starting to brainstorm about what a shared learning / presentation-ish kind of thing might look like at the retreat. And so here's our collective punch list, rather, of things that we think we should cover. And we're really looking for, I think at this point, input from y'all about, do you think this would be the right flow, engaging for the board, and then very importantly, kind of just holistically, some of the roles and what we're missing, and also what we're missing to make sure that we've conveyed sort of the collective picture of all of these audiences to the board as they then move towards reviewing, looking at, and gearing up for that October meeting. Does that make sense? And Caleb, I got that, just head nod or something. I see you sideways. Okay, so first and foremost, we thought convey the portrait of a learner, what we're calling sort of a readiness survey. And this is a survey that the Office of Innovation and Communications kind of collaborated on earlier in May. It went out to the districts earlier in May. Basically, not only asked them, do they have a portrait of a learner, but where are they in a continuum of implementation? And so we have a feel for that. And then we very specific and asked them about how they were engaging community in some of these activities, how they were implementing it in terms of instruction and curriculum and instruction, and then moving towards very specifically asking them if they have any kind of exemplars or examples of actual practices at various school levels where the competencies are being reflected and nurtured and implemented. And that questioning specifically said that it wasn't definitively connected to, it didn't mean if you have a local portrait, great. If you're following the state portrait at this level, great. If you don't have a portrait of a learner, but yet you know that the practices are being implemented at some school level and you've got some sort of example of those practices in place that reflect on these competencies, that's also great information. So we really just were trying to get a pulse of what was happening at the local level so that we could have some input for storytelling and also for this the retreat, so that we can bring the real to the board of what's being implemented at the local level. And then in terms of the kind of flow of thinking, not really specific presentation, but how information and what information to share with the board, then moving into sharing input from the BNF / accelerated learning in terms of that reflection survey that we just were chewing on and speaking about earlier. And then weaving those three, if you will, sort of data points and input points from various audiences together into a story about how districts are activating related to portrait of a learner or not, or graduate, depending on which word they use, how the community input is looking, and then how that community response with the districts can inform this whole conversation about the grad requirement conversation. And I think interestingly is the sort of 6 districts that have already indicated that they're incorporating or soon to be incorporating their portrait of a learner / graduate into their grad requirements might be some interesting like lead in storytelling. So that's a flow. And I think what we're looking for collectively is, how does that sound? Does something along those lines make sense? What are we missing? What do you think would be important to share at this retreat? And that sort of input and feedback.
I'd have a quick question, which is, what is the conversation or the discussion that you want to help engender on the basis of sharing all of this? Are there some decisions that you'd like to make that should be facilitated by understanding that gets created?
I think the end game, and jump in Caleb or Meredith, but the objective is to share this large body of data that's been collected, and especially the work of the Cool Council committees relative to awareness building and actual coming to real life examples of portrait of a learner / graduate in practice from the field with the board to inform their thinking and decision making. And it all, my understanding is that the end game or lead to is their conversations about updates to the graduation requirements for the state.
Yeah,
That's
and
right.
I
So,
would, yeah.
oh, sorry, Caleb. I was going
No.
to just hop in. I think sort of the most dramatic response would be if the presentation sort of indicates that there just really is a lot of hesitancy or resistance, that the board might delay action in October. So part of what could happen is that in August, if the data sort of paints that picture, then that's possible that the board would postpone action. And that's what Chair Young has shared. They really do want to be responsive to the feedback. You know, it's really important as part of, you know, I know you all are familiar with inclusive design and the 4 habits that we're all trying to utilize throughout this process. You know, the board does not want to impose something on districts that they have not sort of partnered with them throughout the process leading up to that change. So I think that's one of the primary goals, is to hear from people in the field. That's why we're sort of collecting the data that Tammy mentioned from the district. So the department is making sure that we have an understanding of kind of where school districts are, but we also want to hear from community members, families, business leaders, and others, parents, so that we know kind of how receptive people will be to this change. So that's really what August is about. One thing I didn't share that I probably should have at the start, as I mentioned, we are going to Dale Hollow, where the internet reception is a little spotty. So this would be an in-person presentation. So I know you probably have seen board meetings where we have sort of a hybrid opportunity. But should you want to participate and present, you will have to make the trip down to Dale Hollow. I sort of alluded to that, but let me just say it explicitly. You'd be making the trip to the lake with us, and it'll be a grand old time. But I do think that Tammy and Caleb and others who would be working on this would like to create opportunities where people can help contribute to the presentation and maybe not actually go to Dale Hollow. So you could potentially work over the next couple months on developing materials that would be shared with the board in advance of the meeting, as well as the slide deck that'll be shared. Because really what we share today is just a snapshot of all the data that we are collecting and hope to collect in advance of that meeting in August.
Yeah, and I was actually just going to essentially say what you had said, Dr. Brewer. So I think we're good on that front, just that we are really going at this with the goal of informing and also ensuring those habits of inclusive design. So, yeah.
As I listen and read the comments in the chat, it really brings to my mind that we can't do the portrait of a learner in its own world. We have to think about what other kinds of things it touches. And I think, you know, Kathy brings up a really good point about making sure that we have, we don't forget the essential skills, which then leads to Cheryl's question about what about teachers? And I know a lot of teachers, in-service teachers, are getting skills, are getting professional development that from what I have observed is enabling them to mesh those skills with deeper learning. But our pre-service teacher programs, I don't think are there yet. And I don't know how we can graduate teachers who are not prepared for this world. And then the other question is about, what about younger kids? And is it really fair? And I'm playing devil's advocate here because I'm thrilled that we're really thinking about a broader person, but is it really fair to freshmen to say by senior year, you need to do this? And I'm taking this from some of my experience where I've observed the 5th grade presentations here in Round County and the senior grad, and of course, not all of them, just a handful. So this is anecdotal, but the 5th graders are absolutely thrilled to be doing this. They are excited about their learning. They're passionate about the things, and they're saying, well, do you have any more questions? And this sort of thing. And so they're going to be ready when they get to be seniors. But if we take those middle schoolers, kids who are in 7th grade now, are they going to be ready to do this? I know we are giving them time, but it's the students themselves. Are they going to be ready? Not necessarily just the schools. So those are, I just want to make sure that we capture those things in this presentation in August. And I don't know the best way to do that, but somehow we need to make sure that we're not just looking at the portrait of a learner in isolation, but we're looking at it in the whole picture.
Those are great points, Edna. Suzanne?
So my district was one of the first, if not the first, to create a portrait of a graduate at one time, and had a lapse from that. We've kind of been returning to it and are revising our portrait of a graduate or learner at this time. And we have done like sort of a soft restart this this spring, of returning to capstones and gateways and all of that work. And honestly, in that work, between some transitions in our district and COVID and all of that, like, we hadn't done anything in a really long time to intentionally do that. We had staff that weren't even on board when we were doing that work a lot more intentionally. And we did it anyways. And we basically just did a soft restart with you have a different expectation at the beginning of this work. And I think that that's what that would look like at the beginning of this work in a district that's not as far along, because it doesn't say how rigorously that has to be scored. It doesn't say anything about that in that policy. It gives room for the district to calibrate and to create their rubrics and to figure that out on their own, to grow and to make that more rich where they are in the process. So I would say that the policy, the way it's written, I think would support any district where they are in this work. And I think that, like, I can speak a little bit to some of that, given the uniqueness of some of the things I've lived through in my district and I'm living through right now. So anyways, I don't think we have to have it totally figured out. I think there's some beauty in having a little bit of local control over this. And that's what this is saying, which is something that my other committee, the Accelerating Innovations Committee is trying to play with, is how much of this should be local, how much should be state. And what's nice about this policy is it plays a little bit with this idea of local control over a part of a policy. So that would be my perspective on that.
Super helpful perspective. And yes, that is the goal. We're sort of trying to find what that balance is. So unfortunately, we have used up our whole hour of time. So we certainly want to respect. I know you guys have already been doing a lot of deep thinking for an hour before we even joined. So with that, we will follow up with an email that has an opportunity for you to express interest in serving on the presentation panel, developing the content, several different opportunities there. So we will send that here in the next few days and invite the Accelerating Innovation Committee to continue to partner with us. But thank you all for joining us. I think, Susan, we have permission to stay on for a little bit longer. Is that right?
That's
on
right,
your Zoom?
Meredith. Yes,
Okay.
I'm going to make you the host, and then we will all leave since we've been sitting at Zoom for 2 hours now. So thank you very much for welcoming us into your meeting.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, everybody.